We've all chased a dream we felt we might never reach. For Team USA, it might be a gold medal. For the team of tomorrow, it might be getting into college or inventing something no one's even dreamed of. We want to make sure nothing gets in the way of those dreams and that everyone has equal access to the opportunities to achieve them. That's why Comcast is committing $1 billion to help 50 million people succeed in the digital world. Because the generation we prepare today is the team that will help build us all a better tomorrow.
Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello and welcome back to New Books in History, a channel on the New Books Network. I'm your host, Zach McCulley, and today I'm joined by Professor John Coffey, who is Professor of Early Modern History at the University of Leicester. John is an accomplished historian who's published widely on Protestant history, and he's the editor of Volume 1 of the Oxford History of Protestant Dissenting Traditions, the Post-Reformation Era, 1559 to 1689. It was published last summer in 2020, and this is the book that we're going to discuss here today. John, congratulations on the book, and thanks for joining me.
Thank you very much, Zach. It's a pleasure to be on the podcast.
Yeah, well, it's great to have you here, and as I mentioned beforehand, now I've just appreciated and benefited from your work for some time, and this book is really no exception to that. But before we get into the book, can you tell our listeners a little more about yourself?
Sure, yeah. You probably can't tell from my accent, but I was actually born in Ireland, in Northern Ireland to be more precise, right at the start of what are known as the Troubles, the armed conflict in Northern Ireland from the late 60s through to the 90s. But then I moved to England, the north of England, when I was about 7. And it's probably not irrelevant that my father was a Presbyterian minister who then became a Baptist, and that's why we moved over to England to a different church. So I grew up in nonconformist churches. So that's my sort of backstory. Perhaps explains the Northern Ireland background, why I'm interested in religious conflict and toleration. But it also means, I suppose, I have something of an insider perspective on nonconformist history. Though it's interesting, I think, looking at this volume and looking more generally at the people who write about dissent and about religious history in the early modern period, how diverse they are, really. And I'm quite interested in what's sometimes called the insider-outsider problem or dynamic. You know, so some historians write about a tradition they're quite familiar with personally. Anglicans writing about Anglicanism, nonconformists about nonconformity, Catholics about Catholicism. But plenty of other people write from sort of outside those traditions about them. And I tend to think it's quite healthy that you have both insiders and outsiders writing about religious traditions, because religious communities need to reckon with their own history, but equally religious history is too important, if you like, to be left to insiders. It's of wider interest in understanding the past and the present. So you asked about my work and what I've done to date. So I studied at Cambridge University. That's where I did my PhD, and then I've taught for 20 years at the University of Leicester. And Leicester in the 19th century was actually one of the great centres of English nonconformity, lots of Baptists and Congregationalists and Quakers and Methodists. And my own work has really focused on various aspects of Anglophone Protestant culture, you know, from hymnody to political thought. And I've ranged fairly widely, really, from the late 16th to the 19th century, though until recently I was mainly focused on the 17th century. So I did my PhD on the Scottish Covenanter, Samuel Rutherford, who wrote works of political theory, but also devotional works and works of theology. I wrote a book on persecution and toleration in Protestant England, which covers the same sort of span as this book, from the Act of Uniformity in 1559 to the Act of Toleration in 1689. And then I've written quite a lot around the English Revolution, a book on John Goodwin, who was one of the few clergymen to defend the regicide of Charles I, and then John Milton, the poet. And I've also written on a broader period in a book on Exodus and Liberation, which was about the sort of political use of the Exodus story from the Reformation, really right through to the Civil Rights Movement. But the most recent project I've finished is a team project led by Professor Neil Keeble, which was to produce a major edition with Oxford University Press of the memoir of Richard Baxter. He's one of the leading dissenting clergy of the 17th century, the Reliquiae Baxterianae, and that came out in 2020 during lockdown, so we had to sort of celebrate on Zoom. But that's the most recent project that I've finished.
Well, you've certainly contributed quite a bit to the scholarship on Protestant descent. And here there's a really impressive list of contributors also in this volume. Can you talk to us about what led to the editing of this volume and what was the push to have this book written?
Yeah, so about a decade or so ago, I co-edited with my friend Paul Lim at Vanderbilt the Cambridge Companion to Puritanism. So this is not a dissimilar project, but I was invited by Tim Larson and Mark Knoll, who were the general editors of this Oxford History of Protestant Dissenting Traditions, to edit the first volume on the post-Reformation era. And they were, in a sense, responding to the Oxford History of Anglicanism, which was also coming out, edited by Rowan Strong. And both of these series are 5 volumes each. They both start with a volume on the post-Reformation era, then they have a volume on the long 18th century, then a volume in the 19th century, then a couple of volumes about modern Anglicanism, modern dissenting traditions, and the globalization of them. So I was attracted by the bigger project, and also by the prospect of drawing together a sort of team of leading scholars to write, I suppose, an up-to-date account of post-Reformation Protestant dissent.
Well, the history of Protestant dissent, it is a complicated one. For example, disputed origins of dissent, on terminology, several turning points along the rise of dissent. Maybe it would be helpful to have you kind of lay out for us what Protestant dissent in the post-Reformation era is, and how scholars have sought to understand it.
Yeah, that's a great question, Zach. So I guess dissent assumes or implies establishment. That there's dissent against an establishment. In the case of church histories, one's thinking of an established church. Dissent in England was sort of a legal category, those who refused to conform to the Acts of Uniformity. So in Protestant England, there were a number of these Acts of Uniformity under Edward VI and then Elizabeth I in 1559, and then at the restoration of the monarchy in 1662. And they required everyone to worship by the book, to worship in the parish church, according to the Book of Common Prayer, the common liturgy of the English people. So they assumed that the entire population would be gathered into one national church. So Protestant dissenters are those who, against the law, illegally, broke away from the Protestant national church. And that, if you like, is dissent with a capital D. Though I suppose we could also think of dissent with a small d, internal dissent within the church. So many of those people who eventually break away from the Church of England or set up separate churches are initially small d dissenters within the established church. In terms of its rise, in the early years of Elizabeth's reign, there were very few separatists. There were very few Protestants who'd broken away from the national church. There was a much more substantial number of Catholic recusants, but Protestant dissenters were few in number. And that only really changes in the middle decades of the 17th century. And it's partly in response to 2 great attempts to transform the national church. First of all, Charles I and Archbishop Laud try and pull the church in a high church direction, emphasizing priestly authority and ceremony and the beauty of holiness and kneeling at communion and clerical vestments and so on. And this provokes a great backlash, initially actually in Scotland, where there's a prayer book rebellion, which then leads on to the birth of a Covenanter movement, to bishops' wars, then the recall of Parliament in England, and the outbreak of civil war in 1642 between Parliament and King. And it's in that political context, that upheaval, that Puritans